So, I finally played Pokémon Legends Arceus. I know this may come as a surprise to some of my regular viewers because it's never been on the channel until now, but I'm a big Pokémon fan, and it's always been a huge part of my life. Without the video games, trading cards, TV show, and so on, my childhood really would have been completely different, and I may not even have some of the friends that I do now. Along with Super Smash Bros. Brawl, Pokémon Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum were the focal point of every sleepover when I was a kid. I really can't imagine a world without Pokémon. But if Pokémon is so important to me, then why did it take me so long to play this game? It's been out since the beginning of the year, January I believe, and I'm only just now getting around to it in September. Well, the truth is, I've honestly been pretty cynical towards Pokémon as of late. 2019's Pokémon Sword and Shield felt like the breaking point for a formula that the franchise has been employing from the very beginning back in the 90s, and has been growing quite stale since the jump to 3D with X and Y in 2013. Even more disappointing were the Diamond and Pearl remakes that fans had been clamoring for years, myself included. The 4th generation games have always been my favorite, and I had been imagining what a new take on the Sinnoh region might be like ever since the Ruby and Sapphire remakes gave new life to Hoenn on the 3DS. Granted, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire were not flawless either, but in that case I felt there were enough pros to outweigh the cons. I cannot say the same for Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. I actually considered making a video about Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl earlier this year, because there's a whole heap of issues with them that I wanted to rant about, but I ultimately decided not to because I didn't actually play the games myself, I still haven't, and I felt that might invalidate my thoughts. However, because these games are innately tied to Legends Arceus through their developmental period and their source of influence, they're based on the same original games, and because I think it's important just to provide some context for my opinion on the current state of Pokemon prior to playing Arceus, here's a quick recap of what I believe is wrong with the Diamond and Pearl remakes. Hell, it's not even really what I believe. Most of this is just objectively bad. They are faithful to Diamond and Pearl to a fault, and in more ways than one. The most obvious way is the visual presentation. Apparently gone are the days where a Pokemon remake would adopt the style of the generation they're being remade in. Fire Red and Leaf Green are remakes of the 1st generation, but look and sound like the 3rd generation's Ruby and Sapphire. Heart Gold and Soul Silver look and sound like Diamond and Pearl, and Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire look and sound like X and Y. These visual upgrades, along with new content and quality of life improvements, made these remakes the definitive version of each game, and well worth replaying if you had played the originals. Logically, you would then expect the Diamond and Pearl remakes to look and sound like this generation's Sword and Shield. But if you thought that like I did, oh boy, you were sorely mistaken. Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl are basically the exact same games as the originals, except all of the 2D sprites have now been converted to 3D models. It still plays exactly like the old 2D games, with the same fixed perspective and everything. Simply turning something into 3D does not mean it's inherently been improved, especially when it's a surface level change like this. I know people were disappointed with Sword and Shield's graphical quality and linear region layout, but I think we can agree that the perspective from which the world was presented to and experienced by the player was probably the most immersive Pokemon has ever been, and that style would have been received far better than what we got instead. I mean, just look at these chibi overworld characters and tell me they didn't crawl from the maw of Satan himself. Diamond and Pearl were only built like this because of the limitations of the handheld hardware they were played on. It wasn't strictly an artistic choice. Players were encouraged to interpret the simplified overworld, and imagine the true canonical Sinnoh region that it was representing. These remakes, on the other hand, misuse the Switch's home console power to leave nothing to the imagination, and now it just feels like the entire Pokemon world is inhabited by creepy doll people and the same fucking tree planted everywhere in these awkward grid-like patterns. If they were really set on recreating the exact same gameplay experience, then they would have been better off just remastering the originals in HD, maybe with some fancy new lighting like Zelda's Wind Waker HD. It still would have been disappointing, but I'd take it over what we actually got, because really, I think the originals actually look more appealing than this. With that treatment, along with BDSP's inclusion of modern Pokemon features like the Fairy type and the removal of HMs, nostalgia may have actually gotten the best of me, and I may have even bought that. But that's only if they didn't screw up in the other way that they did. Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl add almost no new content, like every previous remake has done. And what little there is, like the underground dens, is not nearly enough to make up for what was tarnished, like the watered-down contest hall and the battle frontier. They couldn't even be bothered to implement the general improvements that were made by Platinum, the traditional tertiary release of the Sinnoh games. I guess that just wouldn't have been faithful enough? I don't know, it really boggles the mind. Pokemon remakes historically have set a rather high bar for what a game remake should be, but these games fail to meet some of the most basic expectations. The only silver lining I'm able to find here is the pleasantly remade soundtrack. It actually sounds pretty good. There's really just no excuse for a release like this for one of the most lucrative franchises in the world. Frankly, I don't even think these games have a reason to exist in their current state, beyond maybe accessibility, because the originals today can be difficult to track down and they do require old hardware. But even that could be fixed with a virtual console release of Platinum like they did for Crystal a while back. Alright, I still have a lot more I could say, but I'm gonna stop myself there before I forget what game this video is actually supposed to be about. So let me just close this out by saying that Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl were actually outsourced to a new team rather than Game Freak, who are the usual developers of Pokemon games. And that seems to have greatly diminished the quality of these remakes. But, in turn, I believe it allowed Game Freak to focus their attention on a completely new game in the Sinnoh region instead. And now, having played that game, Legends Arceus, I dare say it may have been worth the sacrifice. Okay, now that I've rewritten that section of the script like 3 times, trying to condense it as much as I can, I'm finally ready to actually begin discussing Legends Arceus, the game this video is actually supposed to be about. I'm gonna preface my discussion by saying that all of the gameplay you're seeing was recorded after I completed the main story, so there shouldn't be any spoilers in it unless you really don't want to see what the later areas are like or what Pokemon inhabit them. I also don't intend to discuss story details aside from maybe some surface level things at the beginning of the game, but that was probably shown in the game's marketing anyway, so I'm not really too worried about that. I'd also like to say that I don't really consider this a review of Legends Arceus. I certainly won't be giving it a score or anything like that. Rather, this is just my impressions of it. Most of this stuff are just things I found myself thinking about throughout my time playing, and I just wanted a place to organize and vocalize those thoughts. When I first saw the reveal for this game, I was hopeful, but also quite skeptical. It looked unpolished and bare, but full of potential to redefine what a core Pokemon game can be. It looked much more in line with what I expected Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl to be, at least from a visual and perspective standpoint. The influence of Zelda's Breath of the Wild was also immediately apparent to me, and for those who tuned into those streams, you know how much I love that game. This game's existence also made the BDSP pill much easier to swallow, because even though the Gen 4 remakes we had been eagerly awaiting for years were a colossal letdown, what we got here in Arceus is arguably better than what those games could have ever been anyway. Rather than remaking Diamond and Pearl in the style of Sword and Shield, we got a completely fresh take on the Sinnoh region, known in Legends Arceus as Hisui. You see, this game takes place in the past, and Pokeballs have only just been invented in recent years by the Galaxy team, who are the precursors to Team Galactic from the original games. Seeing the undeveloped and natural landscape of a region I love so much from a completely new perspective honestly really captivated me. It was just kind of fascinating to imagine while I was exploring where the various locations of Diamond and Pearl would be if you had plopped them into the world of Legends Arceus. You know, just thinking to myself, like, based on the map of both of these games, where I'm standing right now should eventually become a city that I'm very familiar with. And I don't know, I just found that oddly fun. And, to my excitement, some of the iconic landmarks from Diamond and Pearl exist even in this time period, such as the Snow Point Temple, the Wayward Cave, the Spring Path, and the Three Lakes. There are plenty of references to future locations on the map that show how those places got their namesake too, such as Veilstone Cape, the Sand Gem Flats, and the Salacian Ruins. And of course, how could I not mention Mount Coronet, complete with Spear Pillar at its summit? Although, to be honest, if it weren't for Mount Coronet, it would actually be pretty easy to often forget that you're even in the Sinnoh region. Even with all these iconic landmarks I just mentioned, the spaces are so vast and with varying elevations that they can actually sometimes be tricky to find. So most of the time it feels like you're in a completely new region. But, as I mentioned, Mount Coronet is a constant presence that just looms over you in the distance. It's visible from each of the 5 areas you can visit, and it is always there to remind you of where you are. I think the music also serves this purpose, because many of the old beloved tracks from Generation 4 have been remixed or worked into new tracks to hit you with an incredible sense of nostalgia. The theme for Jubilife Village even becomes increasingly more recognizable as you progress. Of course, there's new music too. One of my favorites is this one nighttime theme that, to me, sounds like something out of Subnautica. I'll have more of the new tracks playing throughout the video, so I'm sure by now you've already heard how good they are. I also like that they retconned the Diamond and Pearl startup jingle to have significance to the lore via the Celestica flutes and the Azure flute. A lot of the characters in Legends Arceus even appear to be ancestors of characters from Diamond and Pearl, as you can see from some of the examples on screen. However, I will say that I think my favorite character is gotta be Adaman, and as far as I can tell, he's completely new. I don't think he's based on anyone from the originals. Also, another random character I wanted to mention is the crafting guy, because I think his son is the main character of the Hisuian Snow animated series. And I don't know, I think that's a very random but cool detail, and it just makes the world feel more alive. By the way, you should totally watch Hisuian Snow if you're a Pokemon fan. It's on YouTube, it's free, and it's really good. But pulling it back to the subject of the region for a moment, I wanted to mention the presence of ruins that are scattered throughout it. I really love this element of world building and environmental storytelling. Even though most of the people playing this game will immediately recognize that this destroyed statue is obviously Giratina, it still just felt really cool to discover, and to see how it's broken and separated from Dialga and Palkia, which symbolizes how it was banished to the Distortion world. This might be considered a spoiler, but I also just have to mention just how much of a childhood dream come true it was to be able to walk around Spear Pillar, not only in 3D, but also before it was destroyed. That was awesome. Even if there's not a whole lot to do here, you know, the location itself really is not particularly remarkable in any way, there's just something about being in its presence that forced me to pause and just experience the moment of being there. I could say the same for other places like Snowpoint Temple and Turnback Cave, but that's definitely to a lesser extent. Although, Turnback Cave actually was really fun for a different reason, because I completely cheesed it and got inside earlier than you're intended to. You see, you're not meant to be able to reach the top where the cave actually is until you at least have Sneasler to climb the exterior. But I managed to Skyrim the shit out of it using a dismount technique with Word Ear and a whole lot of patience. Sadly, the cave was empty at that point in the game, but it was still a really fun and memorable moment. But what would a Pokemon world be without the Pokemon themselves? The selection of Pokemon featured in this game are mostly from Generation 4, for obvious reasons, with others that were originally from other regions, but were part of the Sinnoh regional decks, and some Pokemon that didn't even exist yet when Diamond and Pearl were released, way back in 2006. There's even a handful of completely new Pokemon and new forms of existing ones here that have never been seen before. From what I can tell, I think all of the new Pokemon are involved in the main story in some way, with the most prominent ones being the rideable Pokemon that you meet throughout your journey. Also, just another random neat element, I think, is how you can acquire modern artificial Pokemon through space-time distortions. Overall, I think this game has a really solid roster of Pokemon, but there is one thing that I could not help but notice. Where are the fire types? And it's like history is repeating itself, because this was also a problem in Diamond and Pearl. And it's just so bizarre to me that it happened again. Now, after I noticed what seemed to be a lack of fire types, I checked the Pokédex online, and actually, there does seem to be a decent amount of them. But I don't know, while I was playing, they were extremely few and far between, which is problematic if you don't choose the fire type starter. Now this is exactly why I think basically everybody went for Infernape on subsequent playthroughs of the old games, myself included. So, not including Cyndaquil, which I did not have the foresight to choose, I only found Growlithe, Magmar, and an Alpha Ninetales that proved too difficult to catch at the time that I initially found it. All three of these are found in the third area of the game, and it was not until I revisited the first area later on when I had finally had the ability to cross water. By the way, your character just cannot swim for shit. You sink like a stone. But it wasn't until then that I found a Chimchar, and even later, in the same area, I found an outbreak of Ponytas while I was working on a side quest. I suppose you could also evolve Eevee with a Firestone, but those aren't super common either. The stone, I mean. Eevee's pretty easy to find. I found one very early on. Oh well, hey, you know, in the grand scheme, this is definitely not a major gripe I have with the game. I just felt it was worth mentioning. As for how you encounter these Pokemon, they're roaming out in the open once again, an approach that seems to thankfully be sticking around, as it seems Scarlet and Violet will continue this new format. At first glance, the environments look like the wild areas from Sword and Shield, but trust me, there's a lot more going on here. First of all, the way you interact with wild Pokemon has just been completely overhauled. You can catch a Pokemon without ever even engaging it in a battle, mostly through stealth. Pokemon are much more interactive, and you can use a variety of items and strategies to manipulate their behavior. They also have a lot more personality now. You know, they have a lot more unique animations, which show how they actually respond to your input in certain situations. If you do find yourself in a situation where battle is necessary, you actually have to throw your Pokemon at the aggressor to start a fight, rather than just walking into it like before. In fact, doing that is actually quite dangerous, because in this game, while you're exploring, wild Pokemon will attack you just as much as they would your Pokemon. This makes for some very fun and interesting situations, including boss fights, where the player character finally gets to actually be involved in the action somewhat, rather than just shouting commands from the sidelines. This also brings with it another change, as now you'll only black out if your character takes too much damage. So you can actually walk around with a party of completely fainted Pokemon. And while I'm on the subject of fainted Pokemon, that does remind me of one of my points of frustration with this game. First, I need to just mention that this game brings back the full party XP share system, which means that all of your conscious Pokemon will receive XP whenever you catch or defeat one, regardless of your Pokemon's involvement. Now, I know that many people dislike this system as it can make the game too easy. And in traditional style Pokemon games like Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, I definitely agree. Especially in those games actually, because the original games didn't have the full party XP share, and the remakes were not rebalanced for that change, so it just makes them stupidly easy. But in the case of Legends Arceus, I actually think it helps the pace of the game tremendously, because there is much less of an emphasis on battling in this game. I never felt like I was overleveled, and some of the fights actually did prove to be a decent challenge. Although, the only one that I ever actually lost to was a certain somebody in the post-game that I don't want to spoil, but holy shit was that fight ridiculous. I mean, borderline unfair, really. I only eventually won just through dumb luck. If you know who I'm talking about, I'm sure you know the struggle. Okay, but back to the XP share. I will say, though, that there should definitely be a toggle to turn it off, or have a harder difficulty mode where it's not present. The gripe I previously mentioned actually has more to do with when XP is rewarded. Rather than award XP every time you defeat a Pokemon, which I believe was previously always the case, Legends Arceus only gives you XP at the very end of a battle, and fainted Pokemon do not receive XP. This means that a Pokemon can do most of the heavy lifting in a fight, but have absolutely nothing to show for it if it's fainted when the fight ends. Because of this, I found myself constantly trying to revive my Pokemon at the end before delivering the finishing blow to my opponent, especially in bigger battles that reward a lot of XP. But the Pokemon I currently had sent out would get knocked out in the process, and I would just get stuck in this cycle of wasting revives to maximize my XP gain. Another concern I have about this game is its replayability. You might have heard me say that there's less of an emphasis on battling in Legends Arceus. Well, in my experience, the best part of replaying a Pokemon game is going through it with a different team to battle with. So, without much of that incentive, I don't know that I'll really want to start a new playthrough of this game anytime soon. Arceus is all about exploring and completing the Pokédex, which is great, it's a lot of fun. But after you've seen and caught everything once, I just don't really see why you would want to go through that again. As much as I enjoyed the refreshing catching mechanics, this game just kind of feels like a one and done for me, which is unfortunate. Oh, well, I guess this is the complaint part of the video now, because there is one more sour topic I want to address. I only briefly mentioned battling earlier, because the new Agile and Strong Style mechanic is deserving of its own section in the video. I guess you could consider this the traditional new quote-unquote gimmick of this game, but I think it has far more of an impact than Mega Evolution, Z-Moves, or Dynamax ever did because of how these attack styles tie into the turn system. It's not just make the move stronger to finish off your opponent, or make the move weaker to help with catching a Pokemon. Although it certainly is useful for those situations, the greatest impact the move styles have are on the turn order. The more you use strong style moves, the longer you'll have to wait for your next turn. Likewise, the more you use agile moves, the more moves you'll get to use uninterrupted. It's a game of balance, because your opponent can also use strong and agile moves, which means if you use strong and they use agile or vice versa, things can get out of hand. So you definitely want to be strategic about when you go for the big attack. As always, your Pokemon's speed also has an impact on how soon your next turn will be. But I actually find this a bit frustrating here, because sometimes you'll knock out a Pokemon, and the turn order will indicate that you will get the next attack as well. But then, your opponent's next Pokemon is sent out, and it's faster than the previous one they had, and so now the turn order is changed, and you are being attacked instead with nothing you can do about it. It feels like the strong agile system just wasn't really made with the speed influence in mind, but they had to include it so that the speed stat would still have some relevance. Although, I suppose the order has to be determined by something in case no strong or agile moves are used, but I don't know, the whole thing still just feels a bit messy. In order for this new system to work, the foundation of battles had to be changed. In the traditional battle format, turns are organized in sets, where each party makes their decision at the same time, then the speed stat of the Pokemon determines who will go first, unless a special priority move is used. After both moves play out, that set ends and the next one begins, and the cycle continues. Basically, the only way to attack twice in a row is to be the second attack in one set, then the first attack in the next, possibly by using a priority move like Extreme Speed the second time, or using a switch move like U-Turn the first time to bring out a faster Pokemon for the next set. But your opponent could still switch Pokemon at the start of the second set to interrupt you. Having both parties make their decision at the same time also means that you have to predict your opponent's actions, and you cannot react to them immediately. In Legends Arceus, the new system changes this so that when you are presented with the battle window, it is your turn and your turn only. This means that whenever you see this menu, you know for absolute certain that you will get the next attack. However, your opponent will also be able to base their decision off of your last action, so bait tactics are pretty much impossible. For example, where you could normally bait an opponent into choosing a ground type move, and then switch into a flying type for a free swap without taking any damage, your opponent will now choose their next move after you have swapped Pokemon. This is also why moves like Protect don't exist in this game. Ultimately, I do like that they tried something new here, but I think they need to go back to the drawing board with this format if it's going to stick around. As of right now, I prefer the traditional battle format. Okay, I'm now at the point where I just want to actually start working on this video, because I've been trying to write this script in between school assignments and it's been weeks. I still need to capture gameplay, record a voiceover, which, hello, I'm doing right now, and edit everything together. So I'm just gonna speedrun through everything that's left in my TXT file of things to address in this script with a lightning round. 1. I feel it's worth noting that I have a digital copy of the game, and the game did crash on me twice during my playthrough. Thankfully, Legends Arceus has a toggleable autosave feature that's on by default, which I believe is a first for the series. 2. Why can't you throw Pokeballs from Wurdeer like you can with Basculegion? It just feels lazy, really. Like they only gave you the ability on Basculegion out of necessity, so they couldn't be arsed to do it for Wurdeer because you can already throw Pokeballs on land without it. Just disappointing, really. 3. You can trade with other players, but you can't battle them. Battling has been a staple of Pokemon since day one, and this decision really baffles me. I guess they thought it wouldn't be worth it because there aren't any held items or abilities in this game to shake things up, but it wouldn't hurt to include. Or, I don't know, maybe they just thought that the new battle system wouldn't work with PvP and it was only viable for fighting AI. Regardless of the reason, I think it sucks. 4. A graphical issue that really ought to be fixed is this weird pixelated outline that occurs whenever a model is overlaid on top of the surface of water. It happens with characters, Pokemon, Pokeballs, you name it. It's totally scuffed. 5. Catching legendaries is way too easy in this game. There should be some tension and a sense of accomplishment, but I caught almost every legendary on my first attempt, and it ended up feeling like I was just completing a checklist. 6. Speaking of legendaries, there is a certain quest involving one that requires you to read a story that can only be found in Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl in order to figure out what to do. Now, part of me does think this is kind of cool, because it ties the games together, and it really just helps sell the fact that they both take place in Sinnoh, only in different time periods. Using a story that has been passed down through the ages to the present day, BDSP, in order to fulfill that same story in the past, Legends Arceus, is neat. And I really wish they took it a step further and made it so that the player character in Legends Arceus is the hero mentioned in the story. Tangent aside, I ultimately think that this idea definitely should have been reworked, because unless you own Brilliant Diamond or Shining Pearl, which I do not, and also happened to read one particular book in the Canalave library in those games, and you remember the name of said story so that you think to go back to the library to check it after receiving the quest in Arceus, you must use the internet to complete this mission. And I just think that really sucks. I guess you could also buy a game guide, but it's not like that's really any better. These resources are good for when you get stuck and need help figuring something out, but they should never be required. The story needs to appear in Legends Arceus somewhere, even if it's difficult to find. Why not have it be split up into multiple pages that you need to find using Ursaluna, like the verses? Or have it be told at a ruin site through the glyph system so you have to translate it. You could do that in addition to having the story in BDSP, so that way players who remember seeing it there are rewarded for their exploration, but it's not required. Alright, that's all I've got for this video, so I'll close this out by saying that I really hope the Pokemon franchise continues to follow the path that Legends Arceus has set it on going forward. I know this video got a bit more negative towards the end, but I assure you my overall impression of the game is still quite positive. It was innovation that Pokemon desperately needed, because the classic formula was getting stale, and I don't really want to go back to it anytime soon. Obviously, this game is not perfect, but it's a big step in the right direction, and Game Freak can continue to iterate and improve upon this new direction if they choose to. Admittedly, I have not paid super close attention to the marketing for Scarlet and Violet so far, but what I have seen looks promising. I know we'll be able to tackle the gyms in any order, and that alone has me excited. Thanks for watching my little ramble about Pokemon Legends Arceus. If you enjoyed this new type of video from me, I'm definitely open to doing more content like this, so feel free to drop some games you want to hear me talk about in the comments. Just keep in mind that the videos might take a bit more time for me to make than what you're used to. Regardless of whether or not this new style sticks, I think my time Let's Playing is over, so you can expect new things on the horizon no matter what.